I have to say that when I was just getting started, there were certain pieces of music that I was so moved by that when I sat to write, I kind of felt the need to try to integrate a little bit of that. I think when we get started, we're a little insecure about our own ideas, and we hear something that's really awesome, so we think, oh, well, let me just sort of see what I can do, disassemble a piece of music, and I'm just going to reassemble it on my computer. But I don't think that's the point. I grew up in a house where there was a good amount of music. My parents' musical tastes were pretty conservative. My father pretty much only listened to classical music, Mozart, Beethoven, that sort of thing. My mom kind of loved that, but she also loved Broadway show music, musicals. She loved musicals. My older brother and sister didn't really bring much music home until I got to be a teenager, and then it was pretty much straightforward pop music. I started playing in bands with friends in middle school and high school. And because I was a flute player, there were certain jazz flute players thrust on me. Somebody turned me on to the album Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield, which became huge when it was used as the theme music to a movie called The Exorcist. Tubular Bells was an album written and recorded by one person, so one person plays every instrument. And it was mind-blowing. Things really changed for me in college for a couple of reasons. I took a little trip after my father passed away. I just literally packed a sleeping bag and some clothes and got in my car with no place to go. And I remember that I had a long-lost cousin who lived in Northern California. So I got his phone number and I called him up and he said, "Oh my God, so great to hear from you. Come on over." And I met a cousin of mine who had pivoted into world music. I suddenly was studying and learning, and he was teaching me Celtic music and French music and Irish and all of this European folk music. In many ways, folk music has informed film music almost as much, or maybe even more, than contemporary classical music or romantic classical music. And I just took to it. Around that same time in college, I started to meet dancers and choreographers, and I became completely enveloped in the world of music for dance. And at the time, minimalism, Philip Glass and Steve Reich and some others became everything to me. Completely changed my life to learn about minimalism, the influences that went into minimalism, of which folk music turns out to be a big part of it because of Steve Reich's studies of African music. When minimalism came and dancers started saying, "Hey, Jeff, you should be writing music for dance," all of that went out the window for me. To break the rules of romanticism and classicism, to allow for more experimental music, how you could be very musical while doing music that really feels like it's not following rules, but the rules are designed to create something new, unique, and avant-garde. I dismissed the value of pop, the incredible polish that those composers, those songwriters and performers have. And, when Kate Bush came along, she'd been around for a long time before I discovered her, the way she incorporated minimalism and world music and folk music and sampling and all of that as I was getting into just a whole range of that. I don't know who told me about this group of 3 Algerian women who went by the name of Djur Djura, who had escaped a very difficult childhood, moved to France, and started putting out music. And it became some of the most beautiful, haunting, and touching music that I'd ever heard, getting into their music, and then Bulgarian women's choir, and seeing how Western composers and musicians were starting to integrate this became very touching to me as well. At one point in college, I switched roommates, and something happened in that process because I, for the first time, had somebody in my life introduce me to something I had never paid attention to, and it was film music. I didn't really know that it was much of a thing. And I have a roommate who says, "You've never really listened to a film score album?" And I said, "Nope, not that I know of." "Well, let me play you an album." And he put on Jerry Goldsmith. And phenomenally, Jerry Goldsmith, who was a huge proponent of 20th century musical styles of atonality and advanced compositional techniques and orchestrational techniques. And it was a soundtrack to a seriously bad film called Logan's Run. Huge modular synthesis along with a full orchestra. And he did things that were really weird. And I remember there was a moment where he had a timpani at triple fortissimo, blazingly loud. And with it, a piccolo solo played in the bottom register, which you can barely hear. He did something which wasn't technically feasible, something you could never hear against a timpani player playing the loudest they could play with hard mallet, because you can multi-track record. You could record an orchestra and balance it later. And then I realized, oh, wait a minute, you can get rid of rules? This put me on an amazing journey of understanding film music. And within a couple of years, I started meeting film composers. I was orchestrating and doing synthesizer programming for, at first, Basil Polidoris and other very classically trained film composers and a bunch that nobody's ever heard of, and then started working with Mark Isham. His musical background is fascinating. He's a jazz musician with a tremendous array of electronic instruments. Years and years before I met Mark Isham, somebody gave me his album called Vapor Drawings. The electronic component of that album, I listened to that album, I can't remember how many times. And then, you know, eventually I met Hans Zimmer, whose influences were incredibly pop and rock. I mean, he came from that British synth pop world of working with Trevor Horn and Ultravox and, you know, all of those bands. At one point, I was introduced to Jon Hassell. Jon and I met when he'd moved to Los Angeles, and we hit it off, and he asked me to be in his band. Jon has this long background with Brian Eno and comes from the ambient music world. I was certainly familiar with Brian Eno and David Byrne in My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, and music for airports and music for film and all of the Eno ambient works. And I didn't realize how important Jon Hassell's involvement was, because he was really the first person to sample African instruments, loop them in a sampler, and use them. Nobody had ever done that. And he became a tremendous inspiration to David Byrne and Brian Eno. I ended up in Jon Hassell's band, working with Brian Eno. The Eno approach and the Jon Hassell approach isn't you write a piece of music, and then you record a piece of music, and then you mix a piece of music, and then that piece of music is done. The technique is completely different, and it's one that I've used ever since. In the Eno world, you experiment until something kind of clicks, and then you take that and you build on it, and then you take that and you build on it, and then you take that and then you build on it, and then you may start getting rid of things. And being in Jon Hassell's band, and we would record ourselves just in his living room, and then we would take the best bits of each week, and those would become the next week. And we did it for months. So by the time we were done, more or less nothing from the beginning was still there. Then we went into a studio and recorded it, by which time we had already filtered out the parts we weren't interested in. When Jon and I mixed the album, we once again started filtering, where we started taking things out and then processing things through weird effects and loops and delays and reverbs and crazy stuff. So we did it again. When I write a score, I always think I'm going to experiment with no goal in mind, and then at some point, something's going to catch, and I'm going to become a filter. And I think it's been a great way to just be a musician. And that came through influences. I've had countless more artists, film composers, world artists from every part of the world, spending time in Bali and getting to meet the gamelan orchestras and take music lessons in Bali. And understand a different kind of, actually very complicated style of folk music. And within my film scoring career, getting to meet and work with some of the greatest world musicians there are, hearing music through their ears couldn't be more different to how we in the West are trained to play, perform, compose, or produce. It's just different. And there's something to be learned from anybody and everybody you come across. In some ways, it's hard to put into words, other than there is something authentic about all the music that has moved me. Something that comes from the deepest part of one's soul and is filtered through one's culture, but from a very personal perspective.